All right, so are you ready to dive into this one? We're tackling The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck by Mark Manson today.
Yeah, let's do it. It's a book that really shakes things up in the self-help world.
For sure. And, one of the things that really jumped out at me was how Manson talks about Charles Bukowski, the poet, kind of a raw, unfiltered kind of guy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and Manson uses Bukowski's epitaph, "Don't try," as a starting point. Like, really, don't try. That doesn't sound very self-helpy, does it?
Yeah, it's like the opposite of what you'd expect, right? But Manson uses it in a really interesting way.
Okay, so tell me more about that. How does "Don't try" fit into a book about self-improvement?
Well, he's saying that Bukowski's success, it came from this radical acceptance of himself, flaws and all. He wasn't trying to be anyone but himself.
So wait, are we supposed to just give up and stop trying to improve?
No, it's not about giving up. It's more about recognizing where we're trying too hard to fit into a mold, trying to be what we think we should be instead of just being ourselves.
So it's about choosing our battles, I guess.
Yeah, kind of. And speaking of battles, Manson has this concept he calls the feedback loop from hell. Have you ever gotten stuck in one of those?
Oh, totally. It's like that downward spiral, right? Feeling bad about feeling bad, which just makes you feel even worse.
Exactly.
Exhausting. So is that where the whole not giving a feck thing comes in?
It's part of it. He's not saying we should become like emotionless zombies. It's more about accepting those negative emotions without judging ourselves for having them.
Okay, so not suppressing them, but not letting them rule us either.
Right, like acknowledging them and then letting them move through us instead of getting stuck in them.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But then he goes on to talk about this thing called the backwards law. That one kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's the idea that the more we chase happiness, the further away it gets.
Yeah, that seems backwards.
But think about it. If we're always focused on what we don't have or how we don't feel, we're reinforcing that feeling of lack.
So what's the alternative? How do we break free from that cycle?
This is where choosing your values comes in. Manson argues that not giving a feck is really about being selective. It's about figuring out what really matters to you and then letting go of everything else.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. It's not about being indifferent. It's about focusing your energy on the things that truly align with who you are.
Exactly. And this leads us to another one of Manson's big ideas, the idea of disappointment panda.
Disappointment panda. That's an image that's going to stick with me. So who or what is this disappointment panda?
Well, imagine like a superhero who, instead of saving people from villains, he tells people hard truths.
Okay, not your typical superhero, but I think I get the idea. Why does Manson bring up this disappointment panda?
He's getting at the idea that suffering can actually be useful.
Useful. Isn't the whole point to avoid pain?
Well, from an evolutionary perspective, pain is a signal. It tells us that something is wrong, that we need to change something, adapt.
So it's not about seeking out pain, but recognizing that it's part of life.
Right, and that it can actually lead to growth. Like, think about physical pain. You touch a hot stove, you learn not to do that again.
Yeah, that's a lesson you learn pretty quick. But how does that apply to emotional pain?
Same principle. Heartbreak can teach you about your own needs, your boundaries.
So the idea is that even though it sucks, suffering can help us learn and evolve. It's like that whole what doesn't kill you makes you stronger thing, but
Yeah.
with more nuance.
Exactly. And this is where Manson really challenges the traditional self-help narrative. Life is going to be hard sometimes. You're going to experience pain, but it's how you deal with it that really matters.
Okay, so we've got the feedback loop, the backwards law, and now disappointment panda and the usefulness of suffering.
Hmm.
How does all of this relate to choosing our values?
It's all connected. When you choose values that are, grounded in reality, values that you have control over and that contribute to something bigger than yourself.
You're less likely to get caught in that negative spiral.
Exactly. You stop chasing fleeting happiness and focus on what truly matters. And when you do experience suffering, you're better equipped to deal with it.
So it's not about being indifferent. It's about directing your energy
Yeah.
towards what's important and letting go of the things that don't align with your values.
That's a great way to put it. And it leads us to another important part of Manson's philosophy, the importance of saying no.
Wait, saying no?
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of the opposite of not giving a feck? Like, isn't that giving a feck?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Saying no is actually a way to protect your values. Like, it's about setting boundaries.
So how does that work? How does saying no fit into this whole not giving effect thing?
Well, Manson tells this story about going to Russia, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about how people there are super direct, like brutally honest.
Yeah, I remember that.
And at first, it was kind of jarring for him, coming from a culture where we're always trying to be polite and stuff. But what he realized was that honesty, even when it seemed rude, it actually created more trust.
Because you always knew where you stood. No BS.
Exactly. And that's the power of no. It's about being clear about your limits, what you're willing to tolerate, and what you're not.
Both with yourself and with other people.
Right. It's about saying, I respect myself enough to say no to things that don't serve me, and I respect you enough to be honest about it.
So it's not about being a jerk, it's about being authentic and setting healthy boundaries.
Exactly. And that leads us to another interesting idea that Manson brings up, the idea that commitment can actually lead to greater freedom.
Wait, how does it work?
Mm.
How can limiting your options make you more free?
Well, think about it. We live in a world with, like, unlimited choices. You can swipe through endless dating profiles, scroll through a million TV shows.
Too many options.
Yeah, and that can be paralyzing. We end up feeling anxious, overwhelmed, like we're always missing out on something better.
Right. Fear of missing out.
Exactly. So Manson's saying that by committing to something, like one person, one project, one path, you actually free yourself from that constant pressure of having to choose.
So it's about going all in on something, rather than spreading yourself too thin.
Right. And when you do that, when you really focus your energy, that's where you find true mastery, satisfaction, real freedom.
It's like that saying, a jack of all trades is a master of none.
Exactly. And this ties into another concept that Manson talks about, this idea that we are all architects of our own beliefs.
Okay, what does that mean?
He's talking about how our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, like creating narratives and explanations, even when there isn't a clear answer.
He uses that example with the buttons and the lights, right? Right. Where people thought they figured out a pattern, but there wasn't one.
Yeah, exactly. It shows how we're wired to find meaning, even when it doesn't exist.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? How do we make sure we're not just making stuff up?
Well, it takes self-awareness and critical thinking, like being willing to question our beliefs, to ask ourselves, what if I'm wrong?
Yeah, that's easier said than done.
For sure. It means confronting our biases, our assumptions about the world. And sometimes those assumptions are based on old fears, insecurities, experiences that might not even be relevant anymore.
He tells that story about his friend's brother, who was totally against her getting engaged.
Yeah, and it turned out the brother had all this baggage about relationships from his own past.
He was projecting his own fears onto his sister.
Right. And we all do that to some extent. We see the world through the lens of our own experiences. But the key is to be aware of that lens, to recognize that our perception might not be reality.
It's like taking a step back and saying, okay, this is how I'm seeing things, but is there another way to look at this?
Exactly. And that's how we grow. When we're open to challenging our own assumptions, considering other perspectives, that's where the real magic happens.
It's about moving from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset.
Exactly. And being willing to admit when we're wrong, which can be tough, but it's so important for growth.
Okay, so we've talked about values, boundaries, beliefs, but what about all the stuff in life that we can't control?
The curveballs.
Yeah, the curveballs, the unexpected challenges, the disappointments.
That's where Manson's distinction between fault and responsibility comes in. Like, you can't always control what happens to you, but you can control how you react.
He uses that analogy with the baby on the doorstep.
Yeah, remember that.
Yeah, kind of hard to forget that image. But, okay, so you wake up, there's a baby on your doorstep. You obviously didn't choose that. It's not your fault.
But it's there. And you have to deal with it. You have a responsibility to figure out what to do.
So it's not about blaming anyone. It's about taking ownership of the situation and choosing how to move forward.
Exactly. And Manson says this applies to all kinds of situations. A job loss, a health issue, whatever. You might not be at fault, but you're responsible for how you respond.
So it's about focusing on what you can control.
Yes. And this ties into his warning against victimhood chic.
What's victimhood chic?
It's this tendency to overemphasize minor offenses, to always see yourself as being wronged.
It's like the boy who cried wolf. If you're constantly playing the victim, people will stop taking you seriously.
Right. And more importantly, it keeps you stuck. You give away your power, your ability to change things.
So it's not about denying the challenges. It's about approaching them from a place of responsibility and agency.
Exactly. It's about finding solutions, learning from your experiences, and ultimately growing as a person. Which brings us to another important principle. The do something principle.
Okay, I'm curious. Do something. Sounds kind of like a Nike ad.
It's funny you should say that. Manson actually uses that slogan as an example. He's saying that action often comes before motivation.
So don't wait until you feel inspired.
Right. Just even if it's something small. The momentum will build from there.
Like that saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Exactly. And when you embrace this do something principle, failure becomes less scary.
Because you're more focused on the process than the outcome.
Yeah, it's about experimenting, trying things out, knowing that you'll learn something along the way, even if you don't succeed.
It's about feeling forward.
I like that. And Manson illustrates this with the failure-success paradox.
Another paradox. This guy loves paradoxes.
He does. But it makes you think, right? So he uses the example of Picasso. Picasso kept creating art his whole life. If his goal was just fame and fortune, he probably would have stopped at some point.
But he was driven by something deeper.
Right, the joy of creating, and that's the point. When you focus on those intrinsic values, the journey becomes the reward.
So it's about finding fulfillment in the process itself, not just the end result.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of choosing the right values, the ones that are truly meaningful to you.
Okay, so we've talked about responsibility, taking action, embracing failure, choosing values. Anything else?
Well, there's one more big theme that runs through the book: pain.
Yeah, can't really avoid that one, can we?
Not really. And Manson doesn't try to sugarcoat it. He says pain is often a necessary part of growth. He even brings up this Polish psychologist who studied World War II survivors.
What was his name? Dabrowski.
Yeah, Dabrowski. And what he found was that a lot of those survivors, even though they went through unimaginable trauma, they actually showed incredible resilience and growth.
So the idea is that suffering can actually lead to positive change.
That's exactly what Manson is saying. He's not saying we should seek out pain, but that our most profound growth often happens because of the difficult things we go through.
It's like that saying, sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to find your foundation.
Yes. It's when we're forced to confront our fears, our limitations, that we have the opportunity to break free and rebuild something stronger.
So it's about finding meaning in the mess.
Beautifully said. And this leads to another important insight: the connection between our internal world, our thoughts and feelings, and the external world, our actions.
He calls this the VCR question, right?
Yeah.
That one took me a minute to wrap my head around.
It's a weird analogy, I know. But basically, he's saying that sometimes we get so stuck in our heads that we overthink everything and end up not taking action. Like, we need instructions for something that should come naturally.
Like his social anxiety, he was convinced people didn't want to talk to him, so he avoided them.
Right, and that's what the VCR question represents. The things we avoid because we're afraid of failing, being rejected, or just feeling uncomfortable.
So how do we get past that?
Manson says, action. Get out of your head and do something. Experiment. Try things, even if you don't know what's going to happen.
It's about shifting the focus from achieving a specific outcome to just engaging in the process.
Exactly. The answers often reveal themselves along the way. And as you take action, as you learn and grow, you start to get a clearer sense of who you are, what you value, what your purpose is.
Which brings us to this theme that pops up throughout the book: relationships.
Yes. Connection. It's something Manson keeps coming back to. Like, remember his experience in Russia? How that blunt honesty actually led to deeper trust.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, but it makes sense.
Right. It shows that healthy relationships require honesty, even when it's hard.
And he also talks about setting boundaries, being willing to say no to protect yourself.
He says boundaries are essential for building trust and intimacy.
It's about knowing your limits and communicating them clearly.
And taking responsibility for your own emotions.
Not expecting your partner to fix everything for you.
Exactly. It's about being a whole person, capable of giving and receiving love without being needy or dependent.
Which allows you to show up in your relationships in a more authentic way.
Right. But relationships aren't always easy. Manson also talks about the challenges of rebuilding trust when it's been broken.
And he says it is possible to rebuild trust.
Yeah, but it takes work. First, the person who broke the trust has to acknowledge what they did wrong.
And really own it.
And then they have to show that they're changing their behavior, not just saying the right things, but actually acting differently.
So rebuilding trust is a process.
It is, but it's worth it if both people are committed to doing the work.
It's like anything worthwhile in life, it takes effort.
Exactly. But the rewards, that sense of connection, that intimacy, it's worth it.
And ultimately, it's those connections, those relationships with others that give our lives meaning.
Right. Which brings us to that big question that looms over everything. And then you die.
The title of the last chapter. And it's a theme that kind of runs through the whole book.
Yeah, Manson's not afraid to remind us that our time here is limited.
So how do we make sense of our lives knowing that we're all going to die someday?
Yeah, it's a tough one to grapple with. But Manson, he actually explores this through the work of Ernest Becker. Have you heard of him?
Becker.
Vaguely.
He was an anthropologist, and he wrote this book called The Denial of Death.
Okay, I think I'd heard of that.
And basically, Becker's argument is that a lot of human behavior, it comes from this unconscious fear of death.
Whoa, that's pretty deep.
It is. And to cope with this fear, Becker says we create these things called immortality projects. Immortality projects, what are those?
They're basically like systems of meaning that make us feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves, something that will outlive us.
So like religion, art?
Exactly. Or politics, or even having kids. It's like we're trying to leave our mark on the world, you know?
Create a legacy.
Right. But here's the thing. Becker says these immortality projects, they can be good, but they can also lead to conflict. Like when our need to feel immortal clashes with someone else's.
I guess that explains a lot of the fighting in the world, huh?
Yeah. Wars, rivalries. It's like everyone's fighting for their own version of meaning.
Okay, but how does this connect back to not giving a feck?
Well, Manson's saying that instead of clinging to these rigid immortality projects, we should actually embrace the fact that we're going to die.
He calls it the bitter antidote, right?
Yeah. It's about accepting our mortality and using that awareness to fuel a more meaningful life.
The bitter antidote. It's an interesting way to put it. But it makes sense. It's not about giving up on life. It's about using the awareness of death to focus on what really matters.
Exactly. It's about letting go of the need to achieve some grand legacy and just living a life that's true to yourself right here, right now.
So kind of like that saying, live each day as if it were your last.
Kinda, but not in a cliche way. It's more about living with intention, appreciating the present moment.
Connecting with something larger than yourself.
Right. Nature, art, spirituality, whatever it is for you.
I remember Manson talks about his trip to the Cape of Good Hope, how being there, seeing that vast ocean, it made him realize how small his own problems were.
Yeah, it's about getting some perspective, knowing our time is limited, and choosing to spend it on what really matters.
So what's the big takeaway here? What does Manson want us to do with all this?
I think it's about not feeling death, but embracing it, using that awareness to free ourselves from, chasing empty achievements and just live more authentically.
Live according to your values.
Yes. He writes, you too are going to die, and that's because you too were fortunate enough to have lived. You may not feel this, but go stand on a cliff sometime, and maybe you will.
That's a powerful image.
It is. It's like he's saying, wake up, pay attention, you're alive, this is it.
It's a call to action.
Totally. Make the most of this life you've got, not by chasing some idea of immortality, but by really living, connecting with others, making a difference.
Because in the end, that's what really matters.
Well, listeners, I think we've officially reached the bottom of this deep dive. We've explored Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fick, and hopefully unearthed some valuable insights along the way.
We've talked about happiness, success, death, and everything in between.
We've challenged some conventional wisdom and maybe even had our minds blown a few times.
But now it's your turn. What are you going to take away from this deep dive? What are you going to do differently?
Remember, not giving a feck is not about being empathetic. It's about choosing what truly matters and living a life that reflects those values. So go out there and live intentionally. Embrace the messiness of life and create a legacy that is uniquely your own.
Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep living a life that truly matters.